The federal government will make a whopping $127 billion off student loan debt in the next decade. That's because of the high interest rate on these student loans. Now, I should note that federal student loans have a lower interest rate than the interest rate that they would get from banks, but they're still making a ton of money off students anyway, something that makes Senator Elizabeth Warren very, very upset. Now, this program produces a profit because the interest rate paid by borrowers exceeds the federal government's cost to fund those loans and administer the program. Now, I should note that the total student loan debt has actually doubled since 2007, and that's because tuition has increased and it's harder to get low-interest loans. And also, student loan profits are used to fund the federal government generally rather than specific programs. Let me give you a breakdown of the interest rate so you understand why the government is making such a huge profit. So the average undergraduate borrower will pay 5.725% to borrow from the federal government. Now, this is in 2015, and in 2015, the interest rate actually increases. These are the increases that we're talking about now. Graduate borrowers are forecast to pay at least 7.27%, and parents will pay 8.27%. Now, just to put things in perspective, when the Federal Reserve gives loans, primary loans to banks, you should keep in mind that they lend that money at 0.75%. So if you look at the history of the Federal Reserve giving money to banks, you'll see that years ago, it was actually, the interest rate was a lot higher. It was above 5%. And then after 2008, they went down to 0.75%. And the Federal Reserve will make the argument that, hey, the banks had issues with liquidity, and we wanted to make sure that we helped them out with these short-term loans. And of course, the banks take the money, and then they lend it at a higher interest rate to the American people. So that's a little problematic, but they will make the argument, the Federal Reserve will, that this is better for the economy.
Yeah, no, it seems better for the banks.
Yeah,
okay,
definitely.
So it doesn't seem that short term if we've been doing it since 2008, at least. And there's a terrible disconnect here where they say, no, it's really important to everyone that we give it to the banks at 0.75, so they could loan it back to you at 5, 6, 7. Then why are they the middlemen? Why don't you just loan it to me at 0.75, right? No, because the banks are trustworthy, but because there will be defaults if we just give it to the American people or to these students, right?
Yeah.
But wait a minute. The banks all crashed in 2008, so apparently they're not that trustworthy.
Right. So the argument will be that the government shouldn't choose the winners and losers, right?
Except they choose the banks that they give the 0.75% to.
Exactly.
This is total horse crap, man.
Look, my biggest problem with this is that the average undergrad student takes out $26,000 in student loan debt. Now, that's the average, okay? So we know that there are students out there that take out way more, upwards of $100,000 in student loan debt. And when you couple that with a 5.75% interest rate, I mean, these kids are going to be in debt for the rest of their lives. And that really harms the economy. You might think, well, I don't have the debt, so who cares? It doesn't bother me. Well, first of all, they can't get rid of it in bankruptcy. And also, they can't actually be part of an economy where they stimulate it. They're not able to buy cars and houses and certain things that help to stimulate the economy because their credit looks bad. They have all this debt that they can't get rid of.
So now, look, let's be fair. So first of all, at least this is a rate that is lower than what the students would get at a bank. Now, the bank, again, puts all this money on top for their own profits. Now, the other part of it is that there's going to be a default rate, so you can't just charge 0.75 because some people won't pay you back, and you got to take that into consideration. There's many different things. And the government, for some people, says, hey, you can pay me back according to your income level, which a bank, private bank, of course, doesn't do. They don't care what your income level is. You got to pay them whatever you owe them, whereas the government will adjust how much you have to pay out in these student loans. So there are good sides to what they're doing. There's a reason why it has to be a little higher than 0.75. But it is sufficiently high now that over the next decade, they're going to make $127 billion in profit. So now that profit, some of it goes back to education because they say, look, that way we can give more Pell Grants, et cetera. But the lion's share just goes back into the normal budget.
Exactly.
So then they go, oh, great, we have more money for tax cuts for the rich, or wars, or whatever they apportion it for, right? But they're taking it out of the student's pocket and giving it to everyone else, which seems a little perverse.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And again, the 5.7 is not an atrocious interest rate. It's like, historically, it's not a bad interest rate. But when the giant banks get it at so much lower, there's an excellent case to be made by people like Senator Warren and Senator Sherrod Brown from Ohio to say there's a significant injustice here.
And also, last year, Senator Warren had proposed legislation that would cap the interest rate to what the Federal Reserve lends to banks. And of course, members of Congress weren't buying it because they're in bed with these big banks. Of course, there's the campaign funding and all of that. And at the same time, let's say, all right, that's a little extreme. We don't want that. There were some members of Congress that said, okay, at least allow these students to refinance their loans. And politicians were like, no. No bankruptcy, no refinancing, get the hell out of here. Let's screw over these students. Let's make sure that they're in debt for the rest of their lives.
Now, of course, they'll say this because we want them to be responsible, and if that's the money you owed, well, that's the money you owed. Except, of course, in 2008, when the banks were terribly irresponsible, crashed the entire economy, and we gave them, in essence, when you include the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, a $7 trillion bailout. What happened to responsibility then?